champagne." "Nothing to eat, yet champagne to drink," reflected Chichikov. As for Platon, he did not know what to think. In Khlobuev's eyes it was de rigueur that he should provide a guest with champagne; but, though he had sent to the town for some, he had been met with a blank refusal to forward even a bottle of kvass on credit. Only the discovery of a French dealer who had recently transferred his business from St. Petersburg and opened a connection on a system of general credit saved the situation by placing Khlobuev under the obligation of patronizing him. The company drank 3 glassfuls apiece, and so grew more cheerful. In particular did Khlobuev expand, and wax full of civility and friendliness, and scatter witticisms and anecdotes to right and left. What knowledge of men and the world did his utterances display! How well and accurately could he divine things! With what appositeness did he sketch the neighbouring landowners! How clearly he exposed their faults and failings! How thoroughly he knew the story of certain ruined gentry, the story of how, why, and through what cause they had fallen upon evil days! With what comic originality could he describe their little habits and customs! In short, his guests found themselves charmed with his discourse, and felt inclined to vote him a man of first-rate intellect. "What most surprises me," said Chichikov, "is how, in view of your ability, you come to be so destitute of means or resources." "But I have plenty of both," said Khlobuev, and with that went on to deliver himself of a perfect avalanche of projects. Yet those projects proved to be so uncouth, so clumsy, so little the outcome of a knowledge of men and things, that his hearers could only shrug their shoulders and mentally exclaim, "Good Lord, what a difference between worldly wisdom and the capacity to use it!" In every case the projects in question were based upon the imperative necessity of at once procuring from somewhere 200, or at least 100,000 roubles. That done, so Khlobuev averred, everything would fall into its proper place, the holes in his pockets would become stopped, his income would be quadrupled, and he would find himself in a position to liquidate his debts in full. Nevertheless, he ended by saying, "What would you advise me to do? I fear that the philanthropist who would lend me 200,000 roubles, or even 100,000, does not exist. It is not God's will that he should." "Good gracious!" inwardly ejaculated Chichikov. "To suppose that God would send such a fool 200,000 roubles!" "However," went on Khlobuev, "I possess an aunt worth 3 millions, a pious old woman who gives freely to churches and monasteries, but finds a difficulty in helping her neighbour. At the same time she's a lady of the old school and worth having a peep at. Her canaries alone number 400, and, in addition, there's an army of pug dogs, hangers-on, and servants. Even the youngest of the servants is 60, but she calls them all young fellows, and if a guest happens to offend her during dinner, she orders them to leave him out when handing out the dishes. There's a woman for you!" Platon laughed. "And what may her family name be?" asked Chichikov. "And where does she live?" "She lives in the county town, and her name is Alexandra Ivanovna Kanazarov." "Then why do you not apply to her?" asked Platon earnestly. "It seems to me that, once she realized the position of your family, she could not possibly refuse you." "Alas, nothing is to be looked for from that quarter," replied Khlobuev. "My aunt is of a very stubborn disposition, a perfect stone of a woman. Moreover, she has around her a sufficient band of favourites already. In particular is there a fellow who is aiming for a governorship, and to that end has managed to insinuate himself into the circle of her kinsfolk. By the way," the speaker added, turning to Platon, "would you do me a favour? Next week I am giving a dinner to the associated guilds of the town." Platon stared. He had been unaware that both in our capitals and in our provincial towns there exists a class of men whose lives are an enigma, men who, though they will seem to have exhausted their substance and to have become enmeshed in debt, will suddenly be reported as in funds and on the point of giving a dinner; and though, at this dinner, the guests will declare that the festival is bound to be their host's last fling, and that for a certainty he will be haled to prison on the morrow, 10 years or more will elapse, and the rascal will still be at liberty, even though, in the meanwhile, his debts will have increased. In the same way did the conduct of Khlobuev's ménage afford a curious phenomenon, for one day the house would be the scene of a solemn Te Deum performed by a priest in vestments, and the next of a stage play performed by a troupe of French actors in theatrical costume. Again, one day would see not a morsel of bread in the house, and the next day a banquet and generous largesse given to a party of artists and sculptors. During these seasons of scarcity, sufficiently severe to have led any one but Khlobuev to seek suicide by hanging or shooting, the master of the house would be preserved from rash action by his strongly religious disposition, which, contriving in some curious way to conform with his irregular mode of life, enabled him to fall back upon reading the lives of saints, ascetics, and others of the type which has risen superior to its misfortunes. And at such times his spirits would become softened, his thoughts full of gentleness, and his eyes wet with tears. He would fall to saying his prayers, and invariably some strange coincidence would bring an answer thereto in the shape of an unexpected measure of assistance. That is to say, some former friend of his would remember him and send him a trifle in the way of money, or else some female visitor would be moved by his story to let her impulsive, generous heart proffer him a handsome gift, or else a suit whereof tidings had never even reached his ears would end by being decided in his favour. And when that happened he would reverently acknowledge the immensity of the mercy of Providence, gratefully tender thanksgiving for the same, and betake himself again to his irregular mode of existence. "Somehow I feel sorry for the man," said Platon when he and Chichikov had taken leave of their host and left the house. "Perhaps so, but he is a hopeless prodigal," replied the other. "Personally, I find it impossible to compassionate such fellows." And with that the pair ceased to devote another thought to Khlobuev. In the case of Platon this was because he contemplated the fortunes of his fellows with a lethargic, half-somnolent eye which he turned upon all the rest of the world, for though the sight of distress of others would cause his heart to contract and feel full of sympathy, the impression thus produced never sank into the depth of his being. Accordingly, before many minutes were over he had ceased to bestow a single thought upon his late host. With Chichikov, however, things were different. Whereas Platon had ceased to think of Khlobuev no more than he had ceased to think of himself, Chichikov's mind had strayed elsewhere, for the reason that it had become taken up with grave meditation on the subject of the purchase just made. Suddenly finding himself no longer a fictitious proprietor, but the owner of a real, an actually existing estate, he became contemplative, and his plans and ideas assumed such a serious vein as imparted to his features an unconsciously important air. "Patience and hard work," he muttered to himself. "The thing will not be difficult, for with those two requisites I have been familiar from the days of my swaddling clothes. Yes, no novelty will they be to me. Yet, in middle age, shall I be able to compass the patience whereof I was capable in my youth?" However, no matter how he regarded the future, and no matter from what point of view he considered his recent acquisition, he could see nothing but advantage likely to accrue from the bargain. For one thing, he might be able to proceed so that first the whole of the estate should be mortgaged, and then the better portions of land sold outright; or he might so contrive matters as to manage the property for a while, and thus become a landowner like Kostanzhoglo, whose advice as his neighbour and his benefactor he intended always to follow, and then to dispose of the property by private treaty, provided he did not wish to continue his ownership, and still to retain in his hands the dead and abandoned souls. And another possible coup occurred to his mind, that is to say, he might contrive to withdraw from the district without having repaid Kostanzhoglo at all. Truly a splendid idea! Yet it is only fair to say that the idea was not one of Chichikov's own conception. Rather it had presented itself, mocking, laughing, and winking, unbidden. Yet the impudent, the wanton thing! Who is the procreator of suddenly born ideas of the kind? The thought that he was now a real, an actual proprietor instead of a fictitious, that he was now a proprietor of real land, real rights of timber and pasture, and real serfs who existed not only in the imagination but also in veritable actuality, greatly elated our hero. So he took to dancing up and down in his seat, to rubbing his hands together, to winking at himself, to holding his fist trumpet-wise to his mouth, while making believe to execute a march, and even to uttering aloud such encouraging nicknames and phrases as bulldog and little fat capon. Then suddenly recollecting that he was not alone, he hastened to moderate his behaviour and endeavoured to stifle